everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast. I almost said Aunty Pharmacist Podcast just now because, I have said that for over 100 episodes on this podcast. If you have been following the podcast closely on social media, you would have realized that some changes have happened. Yes, that's what today's episode is about. Basically, I want my beloved audience to be kept abreast about these changes and why, because I am accountable to you since this podcast was created because of you. On the last episode before this one, which was 3 weeks ago, thereabout, I mentioned that a major announcement was coming up on the next episode, which is today. I know it took 3 long weeks, but this was because work had to be done on the ground to make sure I am ready to make the announcement, which I'm finally making now. That being said, let me first welcome my new and returning listeners. To the new listeners, you're just in time for a great change and a new beginning on the podcast. This podcast is about your health, about your medications use to guide you to live a healthier life, okay? I am a pharmacist, a master pharmacologist, and a researcher, and I'm here just for you. And to my returning listeners, thank you so much for always being there. And thank you all for your continued support for the podcast. Happy 4th of July to my listeners in the United States, which constitute the third highest number of listeners of the podcast after Nigeria and the UK. Now to the business of the day. Why the name change from the Aunty Pharmacist Podcast to the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast? I know many people are wondering. Well, there are 2 major reasons. The first is this. When I started the podcast in 2023, it was born out of my quest to educate patients on their medications use and correct many misconceptions surrounding the use of medicines that I had noticed in my practice as a community pharmacist. I basically started the podcast with the resources available to me at the time. Like I have learned and always reiterated, clarity will meet you on the road. So start with what you have. That was what I did, and thankfully the podcast has continued to grow since then, which is expected anyways because the podcast gives a lot of value, if I do say so myself, coupled with the comments and testimonies I have received from listeners, colleagues, and different people about it. The vision is still very great, and it is expected that this podcast will grow even bigger by God's grace. So when I started, I didn't really think too far into the future, just the short term, I guess. I used the name I thought best suited the podcast at the time because that was what majority of my patients called me. Aunty Pharmacist here, Aunty Pharmacist there. I didn't register the name. I was just winging it, as they say. Now, the podcast is growing. It has reached 26 countries and counting. And it is time for incorporation. For those that know what registering a business entails, you have to apply for approval of the name of a business or entity. And it is only after the name has been approved that it becomes yours. I realized that the name Aunty Pharmacist has been registered by another business. When I realized this, I felt one kind of way. I must tell you the truth. To be honest, it was actually brought to my attention that Aunty Pharmacist is a registered business name. Imagine that. I was like, what? I had never come across it until it was brought to my attention. In fact, this information shook me because the Aunty Pharmacist Podcast has its social media pages at this time with its insignia and logos. But in order to have an identity which is distinct, especially at this phase of growth, I wouldn't want my audience to attribute my podcast to another person or another business. Also, I wouldn't want somebody's name to be mistaken as mine, especially since they had registered it. So something had to be done. Besides, it is better now than later. Now to the second reason. Over the past few months, the scope of the podcast has expanded from it being just about medications use and pharmacy practice in Nigeria to matters about global health. It wasn't something that I sat down to really consciously integrate. I just saw that the trajectory of the podcast was going that way, okay, which was a good thing. I was just bringing to my audience the relevant information about their health they ought to know. And in all honesty, you can't really separate medications from healthcare. Yeah, I realized that talking about medications alone was not all encompassing. I had to talk about the diseases which these medications treat sometimes and the efforts that are going on in combating these diseases. And what is that? That is public health. Now, on a global scale, that is global health. I've always been a global health enthusiast, and as a pharmacist, I'm positioned to meet global health needs of the society through my knowledge and experience in pharmacy practice and research. The podcast has caught attention of individuals and organizations in the global health space, so the name change was also necessary to capture this. It speaks to the global scope of the topics that have been discussed on many episodes of the podcast, from World Health Days to matters about global health in general. The latest of which is the Time 100 Health List 2025 series, where I spoke extensively about shaping global health beyond national and continental borders by individuals. More of such are to be expected in coming episodes, as well as conversations with and about individuals and organizations I spoke about earlier. You see, change is the only constant thing in life, and for one to grow, one must change, positively anyway. I also mentioned in earlier episodes of this podcast, just as I keep doing even till now, that I'll continue to grow with the podcast, and I want my audience, my listeners, to grow with me. In life, we learn, unlearn, and relearn. So some changes should be expected from time to time. Although the core values and mission of the podcast will remain the same. The podcast has grown and it keeps growing. We have reached 26 countries and hope to reach all 180 plus countries in the world, living up to the global name which it now bears. Of course, it will always be about bringing you accurate information about your health and medications use in a way simple to understand, in order to have a healthier world by building a culture of health consciousness, because like I always say, health is wealth. So it is important, very important, to stay healthy. I see what ill health does to people on a daily basis. So if you can prevent it by availing yourself of the accurate information, why not? That is why this podcast is here for you. Consequent upon this change of name and scope of the podcast, the name of the podcast from henceforth and forever, I hope, is the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast. Yay! The podcast's episodes will continue to air bi-weekly as usual, that is twice in a week on Mondays and Fridays, with even more educative, informative, and interesting episodes. A new segment will be introduced to the podcast, which is called Global Health Conversations with PharmG. It will be introduced on the TGIF episodes. On Global Health Conversations with PharmG, I will be having pertinent conversations about health, from your medications, to conditions, with various individuals and even organizations, in the global health space. I promise you, it will be one very interesting segment that you will keep coming back to and referring to and sharing, And the already existing segment, which is Dear Aunty Pharmacist, will be renamed Dear PharmG. The PharmG is spelled Pharm, that's the short form for pharmacist, and G-E-E, alright, G-E-E. So you can still send in your questions about your medications, encounters with your healthcare providers to me, and I will do my best to answer your questions as objectively as possible. And I might even have guests over to do justice to those questions. Of course, video podcasts have come to stay, so they are definitely coming on the podcast sooner rather than later, especially now that we have a YouTube channel, and I know that majority of the people that use YouTube prefer videos to audio, so we're working on that. All right. Most importantly, All social media presence of the podcast have reflected our new name, and the email address has changed to Global Health Pharmacist Podcast at gmail.com. This is not to say that the old email address, which is Aunty Pharmacist Podcast at gmail.com, has been deactivated. So correspondences can still come to that address, especially if there are unfinished conversations on there. We'll still continue those, okay? So for now, you can send your questions and calls for collaborations to either of these two email addresses. I know that it may take a while to get used to, but I'm hoping that with time, we'll be able to fully integrate our correspondences to the new email address and render the old one defunct. But till then, let's continue to use both. You get me? Yeah. Now, I like to take lessons from everything that happens to or around me at any given time. And if there is any lesson I took from this major change that occurred on this podcast, it is this: always start with the end in mind. I think I got that from one of the books about productivity I read in the past. But in this context, I interpret it to mean that you should always think long term. While you may start small, always plan ahead to incorporate growth. In my case, I just started, of course, open to grow, but I never thought about incorporation, which was my mistake. If I had gone ahead to register the Aunty Pharmacist Podcast from the get-go, then I would have realized that the name was taken, because in fact, the Aunty Pharmacist that I'm talking about, the business, was registered before I started my podcast, okay? And I wouldn't have gone through the hassle of name change after putting a lot of work into branding the name. It was not easy effecting the name change across all socials, I must say. So in your best interest, avoid this by incorporating your business name, your podcast name, trademark your business name and logo, patent your concept or idea, just get a legal backing somehow on anything you do to avoid stories that touch. Because like I always say, that idea that you have, at least one other person is thinking of doing it. So don't just start as soon as possible. Also, back it up legally to claim it as your own. Special thanks to my lawyer and friend Ayomide, who made the process of incorporation of the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast seamless and less stressful than it would have been. And thanks to the colleague who brought to my attention that the name was taken, because if not, I would keep using the name till the podcast has grown bigger than this, and it may be more difficult then to incorporate. Maybe I wouldn't even have thought of incorporation even now if that hasn't been brought to my attention, right? So it is a new beginning for the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast. As always, I keep counting on your support through not only listening to the podcast episodes, but liking, sharing, commenting, and even suggesting topics you want to hear about. Please follow the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast on all socials, on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. That is the name, the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast. On other sites, you will just find Global Health Pharmacist Podcast. It is one and the same, alright? Subscribe to our YouTube channel to get notified as new episodes are released. Join our WhatsApp channel as well for exclusive health information before they are released on podcast episodes, alright? Connect with me on LinkedIn. The name still remains Bemisola Adebisi Joseph. Correspond with us via mail, as earlier said, on Global Health Pharmacist Podcast at gmail.com. So, tell me what you think about this name change, about this new name of the podcast. Just let me know in the comments what you think about this, this explanation I've made. If you've had similar experiences, maybe you had a business, then you started hearing that, it has been registered by somebody else. What did you do? How did you feel first? And how did you go about sustaining that business, changing the name and all of that? Please let me know in the comment section. Do not forget to like, to share, to comment, to subscribe to the podcast. As always, we'll still remain on our podcast hosting channels, okay? And all these changes, like I said, have been effected on all of them, from Spotify to Apple Podcasts to Amazon Music to Castbox and to a host of other podcast hosting channels. that you can get a hold of by just browsing the Global Health Pharmacist Podcast on Google or on Bing or on Microsoft Edge, whichever browser you use, and you'll find me there. Thank you so much for listening up to this point. It's your favorite Global Health Pharmacist, Fam G, signing out and wishing you a wonderful weekend with friends and family. Once again, happy 4th of July to my listeners in the United States. Till next time, stay healthy and God bless you. Bye!